Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another Eye on Africa. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center, Michigan State University. Eye on Africa is our weekly seminary series, and we're very delighted today to have Professor Howard French as our guest speaker. And I'm gonna let Dr. Jamie Munson introduce him. Jamie Munson is the director of the African Studies Center here at Michigan State University. She's also a professor of African history, the history department. So Jamie, please introduce our guest.
Thank you so much, Awa. It's really a privilege to have Howard French here as part of our Eye on Africa series. I first met Howard in Shanghai in 2008, where he was the bureau chief for the New York Times, and we were both researching connections between China and Africa. I'm really delighted that he's here with us to talk about his important new book, Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World. His book has received and was selected as one of the best books of the year by the Financial Times. Born in Blackness, Howard tells the story of medieval and emerging Africa in relationship to the rise of Europe and global modernity. It's a beautifully written, carefully researched account that documents how the economic ascendancy of Europe, the anchoring of democracy in America, and the fulfillment of so-called Enlightenment ideals all grew out of Europe's dehumanizing engagement with the Howard's previous book, Everything Under the Heavens, How the Past Helped Shape China's Push for Global Power, was named a notable book of the year by the New York Times and by The Guardian. He's also the author of China's Second Continent, How a Million Migrants Are Building a New Empire in Africa, published in 2014, and A Continent for the Taking, The Tragedy and Hope of Africa from 2004. Howard French is currently a professor at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Prior to that, for more than 2 decades, he was a senior writer and foreign correspondent for the New York Times in Africa, in Japan, and in China, among other locations. Warmly welcome, Howard French. So delighted to have you here.
Thank you very much, Jamie. It's a delight for me to be with you again here today, and thank you to Dr. Saar also for her kind and generous invitation. I'm sorry that the lingering pandemic has prevented us from gathering in person, but I'm so happy that we're able to have this conversation, and I look forward to engaging with all of you who are participating after my opening presentation. So I wrote a book whose title you've heard, and I'm going to try to do justice to the title in the way that I open my remarks with you. In speaking first about the making of the modern world, initially about what the modern world is and how we should consider that term for the purposes of this conversation. And then subsequently, I want to speak to some of the issues that Dr. Monson raised so eloquently in her introduction, about how Africa and Africans, and it's important to use both of those terms, impacted the West, in fact, created the West, as I believe, and drove its ascension in terms of wealth and power in the world, and finally also anchored the fulfillment in the purest sense of the term of the most fundamental values of the Enlightenment. So modernity is, of course, a phrase or a term of social science that's much debated and whose meaning varies according to its usage. I am speaking here of modernity in a very common sense, common in terms of the way we are frequently educated, we meaning here in the United States, but I think generally in the West, whereby at a certain point in history, the world comes together, so to speak. The continents are connected with a depth and with an intensity that had not ever existed before, and that this sets in motion all sorts of changes and processes that we collectively come to understand as modernity. And the way the story is traditionally told focuses on explorers from Iberia. The most famous of these explorers is Christopher Columbus, and of course, and in fact, Christopher Columbus is often given pride of place in the telling of how modernity starts. And so the standard narrative, which many of us learn in elementary school, but if not by then in junior high school and in high school, is that Columbus set out from Spain westward into the Atlantic in hopes of discovering Asia, and that Asia was, this reflected a longstanding obsession by Europeans in general, but by Iberians in particular, to connect via the sea their continent with Asia. Asia means different things, of course. Let us understand by Asia for this conversation what is sometimes called South Asia and also East Asia. These parts of the world in this era, meaning in the late Middle Ages, were considered to be the greatest centers of wealth and commerce in the world. And so the Iberians, according to the standard narrative, were totally obsessed with finding a sea route to Asia. And this obsession, we are told in the accounts that go this far, most accounts, at least in high school, junior high and high school, don't even mention this, but when you get into more sophisticated accounts of this history, we are told that this obsession was driven by the rise of Islam or the Ottomans in the Eastern Mediterranean, who prevented European access to the East over land. There are many, many reasons why this story is not a full or even accurate one. And we could speak for an entire seminar about just about this single topic, but I can't do that because I want to cover 500 or 600 years of history with you. And so I'm going to try to be brief and hopefully also effective in debunking this core narrative about the start of modernity. By saying that, let me back up before I do this to say that in this presentation of a European obsession, and especially of an Iberian obsession with connecting by sea to Asia, the standard narrative essentially presents Africa, if it is mentioned at all, as simply a geographic obstacle, that Africa had to be circumnavigated, that a way had to be found around Africa. And implicit in this idea of circumnavigation is the notion that Africa was historically, culturally, civilizationally, and in terms of wealth, lacking in interest. Okay, so now let me turn to what I hope you will find a persuasive debunking of this narrative. In the previous century, meaning almost, in fact, 2 centuries before Christopher Columbus and his so-called discovery of the New World, monumental historic events took place connecting Africa with what is sometimes termed the Middle East, and then with the broader world beyond that. And these events centered in Mali, the Empire of Mali, when in the year 1324, the emperor of that polity, a man named Mansa Musa, who is known somewhat to popular culture today as possibly the richest individual to have ever lived, sets off in pilgrimage to Mecca, 3,500 miles across the Sahel and Sahara Desert. And along the way, he stops in Cairo, and he lodges at the feet of the Great Pyramids and spends a period of a few months in Cairo before proceeding onward to Mecca. This implies, and you should certainly understand, that Mali was an Islamic empire at the time, very extensive empire straddling most of the Sahel, but also having a window onto the Atlantic in parts of present-day Senegal and perhaps southern Mauritania. But in order to understand the start of the modern world, we must understand first what this diplomacy of Mansa Musa, this religious pilgrimage and diplomacy that surrounded it by Mansa Musa constituted, and what its effects were. So Mansa Musa, we know, or I should say, is known to have traveled with a very large procession. We don't know exactly how many people, but literally tens of thousands of people accompanied him on this pilgrimage. So this is an extraordinarily large event. And with him, he carried it is believed 18 tons of gold. This is more gold than anyone in that part of the world, or indeed in any part of the world, had ever seen in the control of any one individual in any one place at a given time. And in fact, I'm not aware of any moment in history since then when anyone has presented in his possession or under his control as an individual so much wealth. So Mansa Musa, in his pilgrimage or on his stop in Cairo prior to his arrival in Mecca, is known to have distributed huge amounts of gold. And this gold was so abundant that it reversed the longstanding ratio in value between gold and silver, silver having usually been almost always in history cheaper by weight than gold. Suddenly, gold is so abundant that gold is cheaper than silver. The price of gold is devalued, it's depressed on world markets for the next decade or more. And word of Mansa Musa's existence and of the wealth of this kingdom spreads very rapidly, far beyond the immediate environs of Cairo and Mecca, and indeed well into Europe. And so I posit this as the beginning of the modern world for what happened as a result of these events. Word of this incredible amount of wealth, so these acts of patronage that Mansa Musa engaged in, distributing gold to local officials, to religious figures, even to commoners along the way, as acts of grace or generosity, having depressed the price of gold in the broad Mediterranean world. Word of Mansa Musa and Mali's wealth spreads deeply into Europe, and this sets a fire in the imaginations of Europeans and especially of Iberians. And this, in sort of the initial stages of this fire, as I'm calling it, there's a flurry of historic map making that takes place, which results in the creation of some of the most beautiful and maps ever created, but also the most detailed maps ever created up until that point of the world of Africa. And a focus of this map making is a sort of informed speculation about the location of Mali. Where could this kingdom be, this place where so much wealth abounds? Where is it located? And the most famous of these maps figures on the cover of my book. It's called the Catalan Atlas, which was made on the island of Mallorca by a map maker named Abraham Cresques, who was of Jewish origin living on the island of Mallorca. Jews were very important in understanding the details of African geography because there had been Jewish traders for centuries on the fringes on both sides of the fringes of the Sahara. And so Cresques, through this religious and cultural connection, probably had some special insights into the source of Mansa Musa and or the location of Mansa Musa and the source of his wealth. Anyway, this fever or this imagination, this focus in the imagination of Iberians on Mali not only feeds map making, but in the wake of the map making, it feeds ventures of exploration. There are a few whose details I won't go into right now for time purposes, but the most famous of them picks up in the early 1400s, in the 1420s and 30s, under a prince, the third in the line of succession, therefore not a likely future king, who comes to be known in history as Henry the Navigator. And Henry the Navigator, who is a principal figure in the Aviz dynasty of Portugal, he launches a series of navigational adventures down the coast of Africa, which are aimed at discovering the source of wealth that exists or implicit in the story of Mansa Musa and of his pilgrimage to Mecca. In order to proceed down the coast of West Africa, the Europeans have to overcome lots of technological difficulties or challenges, limitations that they faced, as well as their own superstitions. We all know famously that the Europeans believed that the earth was flat. Europeans also commonly held notions that that if one were to approach the Sahara, that the climate would become literally hellish, in other words, not survivable because of the heat. And so Henry the Navigator in outfitting and financing these navigational explorations has to overcome the technological limitations of European navigation and of European belief. But nonetheless, little by little, across the decades, his missions begin to make progress down the coast of West Africa, first arriving in present-day Mauritania, then Senegal, and on and on and on. If you know the map of Africa, you can figure out the subsequent stops: Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ivory Coast, and finally, in the year 1471, arriving in what is presently known as Ghana, at a place called Elmina, which was the site. Let me not speak to the site yet. Let me speak to what was actually found at Elmina. Upon arrival in Elmina, the Portuguese discovered gold in such abundance that even commoners were walking about wearing gold jewelry. And this led them to quickly understand that they had sort of hit the jackpot and arrived at a place of great abundance of gold, and this was quickly verified. And an immense trade in gold commences in that spot. How immense a trade in gold? This is an important question, especially since we are told that Africa was simply there to be circumnavigated, that there was nothing of interest in Africa, that it was historically inert, etc. Let me just say, we've already debunked the historically inert part. It was Mansa Musa's initiative that sets in motion these events. That's the opposite of being inert. But here we have a proof of concept of African wealth in the discovery of gold at the place that came to be known as Elmina. And so in Elmina in 1471, the Portuguese established relations with a fairly small local kingdom, and trade is set up between the Portuguese and these Akan peoples of this region, now known as Ghana, and a bunch of very interesting things begin to happen. First of all, the Portuguese discover that the material culture of these local Africans, meaning the goods that they possess and commonly trade in among themselves, are pretty much on a par with the goods that the Portuguese themselves had to offer. And therefore the Ghanaians, I'm calling them the Ghanaians for reasons of simplicity. There was no country called Ghana at the time, but let's just call them Ghanaians. The Ghanaians had no great interest in the goods that Portugal had on offer. Portugal was one of Europe's poorest and weakest kingdoms. It was a young kingdom at the time. Their principal trade goods were salt, dried fish, and cork that's used in wine bottles. The Ghanaians, as we're calling them, had little interest in this. And so since the Portuguese were determined to get a trade in gold with the Ghanaians started, and the Portuguese did not have the power or the technological ability to prevail in terms of force over the Ghanaians. The Portuguese had to figure out other ways to sort of jumpstart this trade. And this sets in motion a sort of sub-narrative in my book about Africa's role in the establishment of important circuits of trade within Europe itself, between Southern Europe, in particular between Iberia and parts of Europe far to the north, and especially Germany and the so-called Low Countries. The Portuguese were able to get their hands on a little bit of African gold and other trade goods from their experience along the coast of West Africa, spices, civet cat, which was used in the making of its organs, used in the making of expensive perfumes and things like that. And so to get this trade with Ghana started, the Portuguese initiate a circuit with the northern countries in goods that they understood that the Ghanaians would be interested in. And these goods included worked metal like brass and bronze and iron, and also to a lesser extent, textiles. Okay, so this sort of primes the pipeline of trade between Portugal and Elmina, or the broader region of Ghana. And Portugal begins to obtain so much gold in trade with Ghana that 25% of its crown income in a very short period of time is being sourced from trade with Ghana. In other words, Ghana almost overnight becomes a godsend in terms of the economic viability of this young kingdom called the Alves dynasty in Portugal. Spain gets wind of this. Spain is very covetous of Portugal's sudden success. Portugal, I'm using the word Spain. Spain didn't exist as a polity yet. Spain had its own sub-kingdoms, most famously Castile. But anyway, for simplicity's sake, I'm calling it Spain here in this discussion. Portugal had broken away from Spain, not in the not too distant past. Spain coveted the restoration of its control over Portugal, reabsorbing Portugal under into its domain. And Spain understands that Lisbon has made this incredible breakthrough in terms of trade with Africa. Again, this is totally contrary to the standard narrative of Africa being empty, or of lacking in interest, or lacking in sources of wealth, or indeed even of an obsession with trade with Asia being the motor of all of this activity in the early period of the so-called Age of Discovery. Anyway, Spain therefore launches a major naval expedition in order to try to conquer, to defeat the Portuguese fleet that's trading with Elmina or with Ghana. And Portugal, because it had prior intelligence of the Spanish bids, Spain sends a large naval expedition to try to take over the trade. Portugal lay in ambush and defeated, even though they were far outnumbered, they defeated the Spanish. And so Portugal consolidates its control over trade with Ghana and builds an immense fort on the coast of Ghana at the place we know of as Elmina. And this is a very famous fort. It's famous in the minds of the people who visit it in great number even today, for reasons that have nothing to do with its creation. It's famous as a locus of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, of course, which doesn't really get underway from this part of Africa for quite some time in the future. The slave trade, insofar as concerns the Ghanaian coast, really doesn't achieve any great amplitude until the 1600s. So we're in 1482. The Portuguese build a fort, Elmina, to defend its control over the slave trade. This is the first European fort ever built in the tropics. It is a sort of early instance of European imperialism. The Portuguese had to negotiate the permission to establish this fort, but Europe for the first time has a stronghold or a toehold somewhere in the tropics, and this is a kind of foretaste of what is to come around the world. In fact, it's the first experiment in the tropics of European imperialism. Coming back to the Columbus story, just very quickly, we are told that in this narrative about circumnavigating Africa, that Asia was the most important thing. In fact, the obsession of the Europeans, and especially of the Iberians. And in creating this sort of line of explanation of how modernity begins, and in cutting out Africa from the story, we have essentially falsified the history of Columbus himself, and indeed of Spain. Columbus in the 1480s, subsequent to the discovery of gold by the Portuguese at Elmina in 1471, Columbus plays an important role navigating back and forth between Portugal and Elmina as a ship captain carrying supplies from Portugal and trade goods from Portugal one way and gold from Africa back to Portugal the other way. Not only is Columbus doing this, but some of the other principal famous navigators of this age of discovery are also engaged in doing this. Among them, Vasco da Gama, the person who is credited with having, the European who's credited with having found the naval route to India. Bartolomé Diaz, the first European known to have sailed into what becomes known as the Indian Ocean. All of these figures and many more of the great navigators of the age of discovery are employed in this era by Portugal in consolidating their hold over Elmina and in carrying out this extremely lucrative trade with Ghana in the process. It was important to tell you this for a number of reasons, but one of them is because it helps us understand the story of Columbus himself much better. Columbus is one of these figures, sort of, in the next rank of proliferation of biographies beneath, perhaps, let's say, Jesus Christ. I mean, there are so many books about Columbus, it would take you a lifetime to read them all. Almost none of them talk about this African period in the life of Columbus. However, this African experience is key, in fact, to understanding what Columbus subsequently did, in what he became famous for, the discovery in the Americas. When Spain understands how lucrative Portugal's ties are with Africa, in which Columbus played a very important part, as I've detailed, it is only at that point that Spain decides to fund the voyages, the famous voyages of Columbus. Columbus had been making the rounds of various European courts for 2 decades, trying to convince crowns here and there, including Portugal, including Spain, including England, to finance a small fleet so he could prove this concept that he had of viability of discovery of Asia by going west. Okay, so it was only when Portugal creates this incredibly lucrative trade circuit with West Africa that the Spanish decide, well, this upstart neighbor of ours, previously a poor part of our own realm, aka Portugal, is becoming rich by trading with the tropics. We should now we've refused this guy Columbus, but because the Portuguese are making so much headway in terms of the obtention of wealth in the tropics, we should do something with Columbus in the hopes of catching up. This was key to the idea of Columbus's breakthrough. It was motivated by Spain's envy about Portugal's advances through trade in Africa. Okay, so I want to move beyond the age of discovery into the next sort of principal topical area of my book, and that is namely I'm going to call it an innovation, and that is asking you, doing so mindful of the horror that attached to what I'm about to talk to. But what follows in the years, in the decade that subsequent to the discovery of gold at Elmina, is the perfection or the creation of an innovation in terms of business plan, of business strategy, of enterprise, that I argue in the book, and will argue with you here in conversation, was the most important economic event in world history prior to the Industrial Revolution. And the innovation, as horrible as it is, or as it was this thing that we know of kind of in a prettified, euphemistic way as the plantation. I'm calling it prettified because I would like you to consider what we understand by the term plantation in a totally different light. I think a more appropriate description of the plantation is an industrial prison labor camp where captives, aka slaves, are put to work under a quasi-military type supervision, and productivity is eked out of them at the lash, meaning through violence and through physical punishment, corporal punishment. So this thing that we call the plantation is in fact a prison complex, and the prison complex comes together with another institution that is a key feature in terms of the innovation that is so decisive in the historical changes of this age, and that is chattel slavery. Chattel slavery, many of you will already know about, but it's worth being explicit here. Chattel comes from the same Latin root as the word cattle, and it's important to understand that this involves the bestialization of human beings who are deprived of every right and consideration that we normally attach to the idea of humanity, of being a fellow human. And chattel slavery's most important feature, which is instituted right from the start in this age, really for the first time on this scale in human history, is is the exclusively racial basis of this form of slavery. And this all comes together at a tiny place, lost in most accounts of the beginning of the modern age, called Sao Tome. So the Portuguese discover gold in great quantity at Elmina in 1471. By 1482, they have a fort there. They have beaten off the Spanish. The Portuguese crown is now getting rich. It's on its feet economically, incredible amounts of wealth being derived from trade in gold with Ghana. This finances the fleets that become famous for Portuguese exploration in other parts of the world. Let me just pause to say, to help further debunk the myth of an obsession with Asia, the Portuguese don't even try to get to Asia until the end of the 1400s. And so from 1471 till 1500, roughly thereabouts, the Portuguese are not making ventures aimed at getting toward Asia. We're told that it's all about discovering Asia, but for those 3 missing decades in the conventional accounts, the Portuguese are totally committed to exploring Africa. So because they had found gold at Elmina, given the primitive notions of geography and geology that prevailed in Europe at this time, the Portuguese assumed that gold, the abundance of gold was somehow associated with geographic latitude. And therefore, if gold was available in such quantities in Ghana, it must be available in similar quantities at similar latitudes. And so this sets them off exploring other parts of Africa with great avidity. And in the process, they discover the island of Sao Tome, just in the sort of underarm, if you will, of the African coast. That's not an elegant way of describing it, but it's sort of tucked away between where West Africa then begins to turn south. The coast begins to turn southward towards South Africa. It's just offshore by a little more than 100 miles. It's right on the equator. It's uninhabited. It's volcanic, meaning its soils are incredibly rich. And because it's on the equator, it's fed by very abundant seasonal rain. And so somebody in Portugal, one of the Portuguese explorers who discovers Sao Tome, or a crew member, gets the idea of planting sugar on this island. And sugar, which the Portuguese had been experimenting with in various other places further to the north in the Atlantic, especially Madeira and the Canary Islands, takes off in Sao Tome as if this was the place that sugar had evolved to grow in. It's the perfect environment. The only thing that is missing is labor. Sugar, we have seen everywhere in history, sugar originates as a crop in the Eastern Hemisphere. In fact, in Indonesia, New Guinea, that area, everywhere sugar had been grown commercially in the tropics prior to this point in history. Slavery or indentured labor, brutal indentured labor had been used. And that is because sugar is one of the most arduous crops to farm that is known. Just to be very brief in explaining why that is, the leaves of sugar plants are almost razor sharp. And in order to grow it commercially, you have to plant it in at a good density. And then to harvest the sugar, you have to wander among these plants and people get sliced up. It's also grown in the tropics. And so the temperature is unbearable. People get dehydrated. They're injured all the time. They get infections. They die. It's very unpleasant to grow sugar. And so sugar and slavery have this deep association prior to the invention of chattel. In Sao Tome, the Portuguese right away get the idea, because no Portuguese wants to grow sugar for the reasons I've just explained, sourcing enslaved people on the African coast. And the Portuguese begin looking here and there, first in Benin, which I don't mean the modern nation of Benin, but the kingdom that was part of what is present-day Nigeria, in various other parts of West and Central Africa, and bringing enslaved people to Sao Tome and putting them to work on these plantations, which again, for brevity's sake, I'm going to use the euphemism, but we should understand as prison industrial labor camps. This creates an explosion of additional new wealth for Portugal that is sort of unanticipated and incredible for this small kingdom. Sugar was an extraordinarily expensive luxury item in Europe. When I say sugar, I mean refined white sugar. commoners, most people never even set their eyes on sugar. The only people who could consume it, given its rarity and cost, were royalty and highest members of their court. So suddenly sugar starts becoming available in large quantities based on the exploitation of Africans through the institution of chattel slavery in these settings that I've called prison industrial labor camps. And then by geographical accident, by historical and navigational accident, Portugal, quote unquote, discovers Brazil. Portugal is actually still trying to navigate down the coast of West Africa in this theory that gold must be abundant at such latitudes, but they had discovered a navigational technique called tacking, whereby the fastest way to get down the coast of a continent to Africa, mind you, they're not circumnavigating Africa, they're exploring Africa, is to venture far west into the Atlantic and then to cut back east essentially in a triangle like that, and to navigate through these triangular legs. And as they made bigger and bigger cuts into the Atlantic, they ran into Brazil. And so the Portuguese, in the early decades of the 1500s, introduced sugar to Brazil. They tried to institute this prison industrial labor camp model in Brazil using chattel slavery. The initial subjects of chattel in Brazil were the Native American populations of Brazil. For epidemiological and other reasons, this did not work well. The Native American population died from European diseases in extraordinary numbers in this period. And later in that century, beginning mid-century, but really picking up in the 1570s, the Portuguese begin to import people from Africa in chains across the Atlantic in large numbers to grow sugar in Brazil, in places like Bahia and Pernambuco. And this creates an economic revolution in Europe and a social revolution in Europe, whose details I'll get into bit by bit as we go along. Just on the economic point, very quickly. The most famous stories of wealth creation or of the obtention of wealth early in this age of discovery that we learn about in high school. I wish I had a live audience with me, because I could ask the question to the audience and see a show of hands and somebody could volunteer. What is the most famous story you know about of European wealth from the New World in this era? I can't do that, but I'm pretty confident that the answers, the most common answers, would concern the people that we know of as the conquistadors. So these stories are told of these small bands of incredibly sort of intrepid European militarized brigades who sort of ventured into the Americas and took on, against very large odds, huge empires, actually sophisticated empires of people like the Aztecs and the Incas, and they defeated them. And in these unlikely defeats, they begin to discover and take control of enormous amounts of metals, meaning specifically gold and silver, and that they then proceed to cart these metals across the Atlantic in ships specially designed for the purpose, these large-bellied ships called galleons, and that this is the takeoff of European wealth obtained from the New World, and that Spain was in the lead in this process. In fact, from the 1570s, through the end of the next century, it was Portugal that was receiving the greatest dividends in wealth from the New World, and it had nothing to do with conquistadors or with conquest or with the subtraction of precious metals from kingdoms in South America or in Mexico. It was based on the prison industrial labor camp model, driven in association with chattel slavery by African labor extracted from the African continent. And so this is the Africans in the title of my book. Brazil in this era, I argue in my book, and it's footnoted and supported by historical documentation. Even though the famous stories are about Spain and gold and silver, Brazil in this era produces more wealth from sugar and slavery for Portugal than Spain obtained in its conquests. I'm going very quickly here, but other important things start to happen. And so up until this point, you haven't heard mention of France or especially of England. They were bit players in this early period of empire. And in 1630, the English become involved, also driven by envy. Envy is an important feature of these stories. So the Spanish were envious of the Portuguese. They fund Columbus. The English are watching enviously as Spain and Portugal take off. Spain's the mortal enemy, as we all know famously in this era of England. And so Spain controlled the major islands of the Antilles, namely Cuba and Jamaica and Hispaniola. And Spain had its hands full with those islands. It also controlled, of course, Mexico and large parts of South America. The English and the French, noticing that the Spanish hadn't invested themselves very much in physical control of the so-called Lesser Antilles, the small islands that string southeastward toward the northern coast of South America. The English and the French set themselves up there. And the English in particular take control around 1630 of the little island of Barbados. The English, noting the Portuguese success with chattel slavery and industrial prison labor camps in Brazil, then copy this technique from the Portuguese. They actually acquire these strategies, probably seedlings of sugar, enslaved Africans who had experience of working on Portuguese plantations in Brazil from the Dutch, who were then in revolt against the Spanish. That gets a little bit complicated. In 1580, the Spanish and Portuguese crowns became fused into one, and the Dutch were in revolt against the Spanish, and therefore the Dutch, having been colonized or having been the subjects of Spain, rebel against Spain, and Dutch business people in Brazil then begin to cooperate with the English in the creation of a sugar industry in Barbados. So here we see the next extraordinary phase of this wealth creation. Barbados is an island that is 1/3 in terms of its surface area, 1/3 the size of the city of Los Angeles. Barbados, from 1630 to the end of that century, in that short period of time, through the importation of hundreds of thousands of Africans in chains working in this prison industrial labor camp arrangement, produce more wealth in that little tiny place than all of the gold and silver obtained by Spain and its conquests. Also more wealth than Portugal obtained in Brazil. So this creates an envy in the French. And the French say, we need to get into this game, and the French begin to do very similar things, with not quite as great success, but also obtaining, generating lots of wealth quickly in places in the Lesser Antilles like Martinique and Guadeloupe. And then a variety of other things happen. The English, now infused with this wealth from Barbados, are able to mount larger and larger naval forces. They conquer Jamaica from Spain. They take over Jamaica. They implant this prison industrial labor camp in Jamaica. They have a subsequent huge explosion of wealth. And the French similarly then expand their presence into the island of Hispaniola in the following century, in the 1730s. And Hispaniola, in a very short period of time, this is, so you see a familiar cycle here. Wherever this complex gets implanted in a very short period of time, it's the amplitude of the wealth that it creates sort of ramps up very, very quickly. So from 1730 until 1791, you see the rise of the French portions of Hispaniola, and which we now know as Haiti. It was called Saint-Domingue by the French in this period, becomes the wealthiest colony, it is said, and I believe this to be true, in the history of colonies. Hispaniola, or Saint-Domingue, is responsible for 2/3 of France's external trade at its peak. And then in 1791, as many of you will already know, something of incredible historical importance takes place. The enslaved Africans on the island of Saint-Domingue rise up in rebellion against their condition. I am calling them Africans for a very specific reason. They're Africans because the life expectancy of people landed on this island, and in general throughout the West Indies, Africans put into the put to the task of producing sugar for Europeans, their life expectancy is typically 5 to 7 years. That's how intense their exploitation was, how poor their conditions of life were. And so anyone who was growing, who was brought to Saint-Domingue from Africa to grow sugar, was already an adult or on the cusp of adulthood, and would only live for 5 to 7 years on average after arriving in Saint-Domingue. So these were people who retained African identities. In fact, they were brought from various parts of Africa and mixed together deliberately on the basis of the idea that it would make it more difficult for them to form community and thereby strategize to rebel against European control and exploitation. And so despite these odds, these Africans rise up in 1791 against initially France. They liberate themselves from French control. The Spanish then try to impose control over the island, knowing how much wealth is being derived from this place. They defeat the Spanish. The English then come and try to control the island. They defeat the English. And then finally, the French under Napoleon return once more and try to return them to slavery and are defeated. These are the three greatest empires of the modern age: France, Spain, and by this time, Britain. The slaves of Saint-Domingue defeat each of them. France and Britain sent the two largest naval convoys ever expedited from Europe overseas to defeat the enslaved peoples of Saint-Domingue. In 1804, this new nation that Haiti is proclaimed. And this, I only have a few more minutes, and there's really a tremendous amount of further ground that I would love to cover if I had more time, but I'm going to try to compress a few thoughts here in concluding. The proclamation of the creation of a new nation rising out of this defeat of the great empires of the age has its own set of extraordinarily impactful consequences for world history, for American history, for the history of freedom and of the Enlightenment, as Dr. Monson mentioned in her introductory remarks. So what do I mean by this? First of all, the creation of Haiti is the first instance of a successful slave revolt that results in the creation of a nation. In the terms of the fulfillment of the ideals of the Enlightenment, the most famous, the most basic, the bedrock ideal of the Enlightenment is that all people are created equal. Of course, it was said back in that period, all men are created equal, but the idea was that humans are equal no matter what their race is, their origin is, their nationality is, their color. Haiti becomes the first nation ever to institute this notion as part of its basic law, its constitution. The United States doesn't get around to doing this partially until the Civil War, which was 61 years later, the culmination of the Civil War, but in fact doesn't even fully arrive at the realization of this ideal until my childhood, where we saw through a number of landmark Supreme Court cases the complete fulfillment, at least in theory, of racial equality in the United States. Haiti does this in 1804. What else happens in 1804? Having defeated Napoleon twice, Napoleon's France is driven to the brink of bankruptcy and is forced to negotiate with the young United States of Thomas Jefferson for the sale or for the purchase, depending on which party you're focusing on, of the vast Louisiana purchase that France had controlled in the heartland of continental North America. France sells its holdings in continental North America to the Jefferson administration for $15 million. And this overnight doubles the size of the United States. It gives young America control of what all or part of what were to become 15 new states, and sets in motion a huge migration of people from the eastern seaboard of the United States, and especially the so-called Old South, the places where the prison industrial labor complex was most heavily concentrated. I'm speaking especially of Virginia, but also of South Carolina and of North Carolina and Georgia. Sets in motion a great migration from that part of the country to the Mississippi Valley. Now, the normal telling of this story focuses on what happened to the white people. We know that Thomas Jefferson had this notion of creating opportunity for white people. He doesn't actually say white people, he says yeoman farmers, that he's going to create opportunity for these yeoman farmers who, through American expansion, would fill out these vast new portions of American territory in the Midwest, and that this would make for greater wealth and freedom and opportunity and privilege for these people whose race isn't specified, but who are indeed white. In fact, the most important feature of this migration involves Africans, people who had recently been sent from Africa in bondage across the Atlantic to the Old South and put to work growing in the Old South, mostly things like rice and indigo and tobacco. They are now going to be they are marched westward to the Mississippi Valley. They are put to work in this prison industrial labor complex growing cotton. Cotton takes off from 11,000 bales of production in 1793 to over 2 billion bales of cotton prior to the Civil War. It is the most extraordinary episode of economic expansion in this sequence or series of stories of economic expansion that we have heard over the course of this talk, starting with the gold that had gotten the Aviz dynasty on its feet, economically speaking, through Sao Tome to Brazil to Barbados. The expansion of this prison industrial labor complex to the Mississippi Valley creates the most dizzying rise in wealth creation we have seen so far in a series of dizzying rises. It creates the basis upon which the United States rises to the first rank of world powers, economically speaking. It creates the basis for the United States becoming, in fact, a continental nation. And this would be true only if one considered the value of the cotton grown by the Africans who had been brought to the Mississippi Valley for that purpose, but it involves much more than simply the growth of cotton. Cotton is the industry of growing cotton via chattel slavery on these plantations is the basis of many secondary industries, from banking to insurance, to railroads, to riverboats, to transcontinental trade via sea, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, it is the basis of the takeoff of Great Britain economically. I invoked the Industrial Revolution as the greatest economic event of our age, and of chattel slavery having been the second most important economic event, the prison industrial labor complex using chattel slavery as perhaps the second most important economic event, but they're deeply related. It is only through this prison industrial labor complex and its transfer from one place to another that I've described, finally culminating in the Mississippi Valley, producing cotton, that Britain was in fact able to rise as an industrial power. 1 in 6 Britons were employed in the creation of textiles in this era, meaning the era around the age of the American Civil War. And overwhelmingly, those textiles were made from cotton grown by people brought from Africa and their descendants who had been transferred from the Old South to the Mississippi Valley and put in bondage in the kind of complex that I described for you. So I think I'm going to stop there. I didn't get to talk about social changes in Europe that I believe that I discuss in detail in my book, and which I think are extremely important to understanding this history and greatly underrated, unmentioned also in conventional accounts of world history. What I mean by that is the importance of the wealth creation and of sugar and of coffee in particular in anchoring democracy in the 1600s in England. But perhaps we'll leave that for the question period. I know that I've covered a lot of ground. I've also left many, many details out from the book, but I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And anybody who wants to talk can raise their hands and be allowed to speak, or you also can type your questions in the Q&A section. We have a question here from Jenny Olson. Interesting that slave-based economy were developed by the colonialists in the Americas, but not in Africa. Why not? Did Spain or any of the others try to do so on continental Africa?
Thank you. The first thing needs to be said is that in the period that I described in the beginning of my talk, when Europeans were first establishing important trade connections with Africa, led by Portugal in places like Elmina and what we're calling Ghana, and subsequently in places like Benin or in Congo, the Europeans did not hold a great technological advantage on the Africans. So what we tend to know, those of us who don't study African history, is sort of this is in line with the idea that Africa was a cipher, that Africa is this inert place, that Africa is uninteresting from the perspective of history, right? And just needed to be circumnavigated, right? In fact, Africans were quite capable of holding their own on African ground against European expansion. European expansion into Africa physically, in terms of direct control of Africa, with just a few exceptions, doesn't really get off the ground until the 19th century. And that is partly a reason of technology. That's partly a reason of the limitations on the ability of Europeans to project force overseas and to send people overseas. And it's also partly a reflection of epidemiology. Europeans were vulnerable to African diseases, and just as the Native American populations succumbed in great quantities to European and African diseases, Europeans arriving in an African milieu prior to the invention of modern medicine did not withstand endemic diseases in Africa very well, in the tropics.
Thank you. We have another question here. My question is around labor and whether it was central or all during the discovery phase. This is from Ashanda Benya. I hear the emphasis on Mansa Musa, but I was wondering about the story behind the labor that produces the gold that Musa takes, especially because it links so closely to the innovation phase.
So that's a question that's not covered in detail in my book, but it's a very interesting question. So the history of gold production in the Sahel is a very, very old story. It far predates Mansa Musa. At least 1,000 years ago, probably around the year 800 to 1000, gold from the Sahel region, or from the northern fringes of the rain belt of West Africa, meaning sort of northern parts of present-day Guinea and very southern extreme parts of Mali and northern parts of Ghana, Ivory Coast, etc. These parts of West Africa that far back were generating gold, and that gold was being traded, much of that gold was being traded across the Sahel and subsequently the Sahara and into Europe. And this was the source of sustenance, economically speaking, for very important kingdoms, historically speaking. Prior to Mali, you had a kingdom called Ghana itself. And so this is why using the word Ghana is confusing in a talk like that. We've talked about the modern state of Ghana, which is along the coast of West Africa, but in much the same region that the empire of the empire of Mali existed in the Sahel, there was a predecessor empire in that region called Ghana, and that's where modern Ghana sort of adopted the name from. Anyway, the empires of the Maghreb, namely the Almohads and the Almoravids and others, they all thrived from the trade in gold obtained from the sort of southern fringes of the Sahel under the Ghana Empire period, as did kingdoms in Europe. Without knowing where the gold was coming from with any exactitude, the Italian states in this period and various Iberian kingdoms, far predating the story that I've told about the Aviz dynasty in Portugal, were sustained by trade in gold that came across the Mediterranean from the Sahara and from beyond the Sahara to the Sahel and from the rain belt beneath the Sahel. Anyway, so there's a whole story of technology involved here, which I'm not an expert in, but has its own literature, which talks about how Africans in these periods, meaning as far back as the year 1000, actually dug their mines for gold in the rain belt. And interestingly, intriguingly, some very interesting technologies were used. For example, in parts of Ghana, it is known in the Middle Ages that Ghanaians, I'm calling them Ghanaians, and now I'm talking about the modern territory that we know as the nation of Ghana, people there had mining technologies where they were able to dig 50 to 100 feet into the earth in search of gold, going way back 1,000 years. So I'm sorry that I can't see the questioner in person to answer this question, but there is an author named Ivor, I'll spell that for you, I-V-O-R, Welks, W-E-L-K-S, who has written about this, and that's a reference that I would suggest you look for.
Thank you very much. And Asanda also has a follow-up comment. She's saying that your ideas are important, and she hopes that your distributors will make an effort to get your books circulating in the continent.
Thank you. I have I share your hope. When the book first came out, I was really delighted that a single person in Nigeria who read the book, an early reader of the book, was so pleased by it that she bought 1,200 copies of the book. This is a kind of characteristic. Nigerians like to do things big. She bought 1,200 copies of the book and distributed them to people in Nigeria. So that's not exactly publishing in Africa, but I'm hopeful that the book will come out in African editions, and I certainly hope that it will be read widely on the continent.
Thank you. Let me see, I think somebody has raised their hand. Okay. Eric, you can talk. Eric Kessel?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Awesome. Thank you, Professor French. That's amazing presentation and work.
Thank you.
I have a quick question about your work. I mean, you spoke about Ivor Welks, who was a historian of present-day Ghana, Gold Coast, and all that. And I just want to go off of that topic. Welks discusses the historical position of the Portuguese in present-day southern Ghana, the Gold Coast, Elmina precisely, and other parts of the Gold Coast, and their interactions with the Akan people and also the Wangara people, Mandinka traders who came from the West African interior to the coast of present-day Ghana. So essentially, he paints this picture that the Wangara people were coming down to the Akan gold fields, which he calls the gold fields. And the Portuguese were kept coming from the Atlantic seaboard or the sea area to the Akan gold fields. So it's sort of a competition or a cultural exchange, a clash. I was hoping, I'm just wondering, do you sort of treat or tackle this work or this aspect of history in your work at all?
Right. Thank you for your question. So my book covers 600 years of history, and it covers, in fact, 4 continents. And I haven't, in the context of this talk, actually spoke much about changes in Europe that were driven by all of this. And this is a very important part of my book. And so I'm saying this in the hopes that you will appreciate that there are many things that I came to learn in the research of this book that I was not able to dwell upon in detail in this book, including the area involved in your question. What I will say to your question is that I find, and actually I do refer to this quickly in my book, the arrival of the Portuguese, once the Portuguese had managed to establish the trade circuits in Europe that I talked about, whereby they could source goods that Africans really desired, such as brass, metal, and bronze. And then subsequently, especially a few decades later, Indian, meaning from India, textiles. Once those circuits were created, this created a very powerful pole of trade for gold from coastal West Africa that redirects the brunt of the trade away from the Sahara, from the trans-Saharan circuit that had long existed all the way back 1,000 years, and now sort of refocuses that trade south toward the coast. There are those who actually theorize that this was the cause of the subsequent demise of empires in the Maghreb among various Arabic-speaking peoples in the Maghreb, that their own wealth was so dependent on trade in gold that was sourced from south of the Sahara that when this redirection occurred, they were dramatically weakened. I don't go into this in any great detail, but I think that Welks's work is valuable, and I learned a lot from reading it. And he's not the only person, of course, also to have written on this topic.
Okay, NKZ, you can go ahead and speak.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. My question was, how do you think globalization has impacted the psyche of African people and other communities around the world? And then my follow-up question is, what impacts do you think cultural genocide has on African communities, and how can we rebuild and restore our culture from that damage in contemporary times?
Thank you.
From looking at this.
Sure.
Sorry.
That's okay. So globalization is one of these terms that's very hard to pin down. What do we mean by globalization? We can each offer slightly or even dramatically different definition for it. You know, I've just described trade circuits that involve places like the northern fringes of present-day Guinea that go back over 1,000 years. That's, one could argue, a kind of globalization that was already in process as far back as that. And you could look at other regions of the world and say similar things. I believe that, meaningfully speaking, in the terms that we talk about it commonly, globalization really begins at Elmina with the Portuguese arrival there. That this, and not the much more famous, in fact, the infinitely more famous Columbus discovery of the Americas, discovery in quotations, is the proximate cause of modernity. And by modernity, in my usage, there are many usages of modernity, but in my usage, one could substitute for modernity actually globalization, that this is where globalization begins. And so it's my, I contend, it's my contention that Africa and Africans, because this flows out of African initiative a century earlier with Mansa Musa, that globalization flows from Africa, right? That it is an African, its origins are centered on Africa in ways that have been totally written out of standard accounts of history. In terms of cultural genocide, this is a very interesting question. I'm working on the topic of decolonization now. I'm not going to go into any great length on that right now because we have enough to consider. But I think that colonization was an extremely violent event, and I don't mean violent in the sense that African peoples were necessarily conquered physically. In many cases, this did not involve large-scale occupation of African territories by European armies or the very widespread and persistent use of force. What I mean by violent, I mean essentially as psychologically violent. And I think that this psychological violence is an underrated cause of many of Africa's problems today, that Africa was disrupted in violent ways in terms of its own organic evolution as a geopolitical space. And this is a very complicated topic, but I think that colonization has a very long tail, T-A-I-L. And the best example I can give you of this is the name of the book someone is asking is Born in Blackness. Born in Blackness. The quickest example I can give you of the long tail of colonization is right here in America. So Americans are still psyched out by colonization. What do I mean by psyched out? When Americans hear a British accent, very commonly they sort of imagine that the British person, by virtue alone of their accent, is intelligent, or maybe even more intelligent. This is a psychological dimension of colonization that's with us here in the United States, more than 2 centuries after we were colonized. One final thing, in terms of cultural genocide. The most important feature of cultural genocide in the Atlantic space that I know of also exists right here in America. And it is constituted by the success that colonization and American racism through the institution of industrial prison labor camps and of Jim Crow and of many subsequent processes of American history convinced somehow in a very insidious way that it convinced African Americans that they don't have much reason to be concerned with Africa, that their identity isn't very closely connected with Africa, that Africa has very little to do with them. This is a persistent thing, and it is a tragedy. This notion, this idea of divorcing African Americans from Africa, which continues, is the most important manifestation of this thing that you've called cultural genocide that I know of. And an important intention behind my book in writing this history is to show how each of these diasporic identities overcome the silos that we exist within. That means if you're Jamaican, or you're Brazilian, or you're African American, or you're from Haiti, or you're from Ghana, or you're from Mali, that there is a deep root of history that is shared together, and that there's agency involved at every stage of these histories, and that there's something organic that connects these peoples that were flung to widespread corners of the Atlantic world by historic processes, and to overcome our petty chauvinisms and not allow this persistent form of isolation to continue.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
So Jonathan has a question. How does the current interaction patterns China has with Africa like or unlike that Europe had with Africa as detailed in Born in Africa?
I'm sorry, Dr. Sarr, I didn't hear the first part of the question well. How does China do what?
How does the current interaction patterns, I'm guessing, between China and Africa like or unlike the patterns between Europe and Africa in the past? I'm not sure I understand the question myself.
Sure. Okay. Well, so, I mean, there's some things that are obvious that should be said. China has not colonized any African country. China has not engaged in slavery involving Africans. China has not employed this prison industrial labor complex that I spoke to. So those are categoric differences, right, that need to be emphasized. What other similarities or differences exist between China's engagement with Africa and previous European or Western engagement with Africa are, I think, legitimately somewhat still subject to speculation. And I'll explain very quickly why I say that. I am not here to argue that China is behaving in an imperial fashion toward Africa. However, I do believe that imperial relations typically, in fact, I don't know of an exception to this, arise from serious disproportionate relations where one party is vastly more powerful and more wealthy than the other party. And imperial relations derive from a kind of binding that involves these two disproportionate parties. And I think it is an interesting question whether this is a possibility between Africa or better perhaps put, parts of Africa, because Africa is we should never forget, a vast and diverse place constituting 54 countries of different characteristics and needs and priorities and political cultures, et cetera, right? But whether there's a potential at any point in time, whether it's today or tomorrow or in 50 years, between an extraordinarily rich and powerful China and parts of a balkanized, weak, and vastly poorer Africa. Whether that possibility exists, I think, is an open question.
Solomon, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. French, for your really enlightening presentation today. And I did have questions in the Q&A. So maybe what I'll do is just look at the question and read it in the hope that you'll be able to address them. I think the first question is, how does modern day criminal industrial complex, especially most prominent in the US, tie in with the historical legacies of conquest, slavery, and exploitation of people of African descent? Was my first question. And then second question, if you're able to get to it, is just interested in hearing about the eastern part of Africa and why it was insulated from the kind of expansion and exploitation of the West. And any thoughts and comments on that? And sure. Third, are you available to speak at other venues?
The last one's the easiest. Yes, I'm doing a lot of speaking, but I want people to know about my book, and I'm happy to engage with audiences about the book. And so if you would like to contact me, please ask Dr. Saar or Dr. Monson, and or look me up. I'm easy to find online.
Okay, great.
Look forward to hearing from you. The first part of your question is a very interesting one. So my book ends with the Second World War, and in the last sort of fifth of my book, I talk a lot about the 20th century in the United States. And what we see in the 20th century in the United States is in the post-Civil War era, so actually beginning a little bit before the 20th century, we see desperate attempts by Southerners to reinstitute a prison industrial labor complex. They know legally they are barred from restoring outright slavery, but what they do is create a complex of what I'll call, for simplicity's sake, indentured relations with Africans, people of African descent, African Americans, whereby through Jim Crow laws, people are deprived of many basic rights, and through various economic arrangements, they are exploited almost as badly as they were during the period of enslavement. It became illegal for a person of African American descent in the Jim Crow South, for example, to loiter. Well, what does loiter mean? Loiter is in the eyes of the beholder. It meant in effect that if a white person decides that you are not meaningfully employed, then you are subject to prosecution and jailing. What does meaningfully employed mean? That means that the white person gets to decide whether or not you are meaningfully employed. So if you're working for yourself or you're doing something for your family, maybe it will be deemed not meaningful. And therefore, this forces you either into incarceration or back onto the land of the white landowner, where you are sort of made to subsist in this indentured relationship. So this continues for a very long time post formal enslavement in the United States. In the 1950s, this begins to break down. I talk about how it breaks down in the United States with the invention of various technologies and with legal breakthroughs. The most important technologies involved are, the single most important technology involved is the automatic cotton picker. So once cotton could be picked much more efficiently by a machine than it could be by human beings, suddenly white Southerners in the sort of plantation South decide that they don't really want to have such heavy concentrations of people of African descent in their midst. And this kicks off the third great migration in this history of the Atlantic world. The first one being the transatlantic migration in chains on slave ships. The second one being the one from after the Haitian Revolution, from the Old South to the Mississippi Valley. And now you see a third dispersal of people of African descent throughout from the Mississippi Valley and cotton into the broader United States. What is the tale of this today? The tale of this today is very high African-American unemployment, and very high African-American incarceration. And I will just leave it to you to think about how this flows from the prior history. I think important connections can be established. On your question of East Africa and West Africa, Africa is vast. I guess that's the first thing to be said. West Africa and Central Africa are the heartland of the Atlantic world that I've talked about. Most of the enslaved peoples came from three places. Enslaved peoples trafficked to the so-called New World. They came from Congo, Angola, which I'm calling one region. They came from Nigeria, and they came from Ghana. Those, in that order, that's where most of the enslaved people came to the New World from. Okay, enslaved people made their way to the New World, in fact, however, from every part of Africa, including East Africa. The reasons they didn't come in much larger numbers from East Africa, I think, were questions of geographic happenstance. East Africa is fronting the Indian Ocean, and it's a lot longer distance from the Indian Ocean to the Caribbean or to Brazil or to continental United States. And the longer the trajectory at sea, the higher the slave mortality, and therefore the less profitable the business of trafficking enslaved peoples across seas to get to the New World. So I think it was that geography that shielded the people of East Africa, relatively speaking, from the slave trade compared to the peoples of West and Central Africa.
Thank you. Leo, you can speak.
Oh, hi, I'm Juan. Thank you very much, Dr. Green. This has been a very interesting history, and especially those trade relations and how, these European countries were, like Portugal, were very dependent on these relationships, and bringing the history back here into the US too. The tendency to people talk about the impact, institutionalized racism and impacts of the industrial labor complex you talk about, how they persist today, as you just said, and there tends to be an inclination at, let's just stop from here. Let's just clean the slate clean from now on and look forward. Let's not look backwards. But the key question that I wanted to ask you is, looking back from the lessons of this history and the relationships, especially between Africa and Europe and the West, what does it tell you about the prospects for Africa trying to stand up for itself, like the African Union, the African Continental Free Trade Area? What lessons from this history can inform us, Africa moving forward to kind of empower itself and kind of free itself from some of the impacts of this history?
Thank you. First thing I want to say is, so I want to talk about the past before I address the future component of your question. And in terms of the past, the history that I'm talking about had two devastating and very long-lasting impacts on Africa at a minimum, or at least there are two that I'm going to address here. One of them is demographic. It's my belief that at the least, about 30 million people were lost to the African continent via the processes that drove the transatlantic slave trade. So we know that 12.5 million people landed in the Americas from Africa alive, right? We also have a reasonable sort of way of estimating how many people died at sea, therefore didn't land alive in the Americas. And And the sort of larger estimates for that number are about 6 million. What we don't really know is how many people died on African soil in the drive to keep supplying enslaved peoples to the markets that Europeans maintained or promoted for the purposes of selling people into slavery in the Western Atlantic. And it is my contention. So there's this notion that is you will have come across in the current pandemic of excess deaths. How many people would have died? How many people died who would not have died had there not been a COVID-19 epidemic? So just in the last day or two, there's been a big epidemiological study about this in the United States, and the number that this particular study estimated was 1 million. There would be 1 million people alive today had there not in America had there not been a COVID epidemic. That doesn't mean they all died that the pronounced cause of death was COVID, but that COVID contributed to the premature deaths of 1 million people who would not otherwise have been alive, have been dead had there not been COVID. So I think you can look at slavery or enslavement and the processes that drove enslavement and this commerce in human beings across the Atlantic in similar ways. And it is for those purposes that I have, or it is through that effort that I have kind of come up with this number of 30 million people. And if you read the work of one of the historians that I learned a great deal from in my research for this book, a man named, he's deceased now, but Joseph Miller, a longtime historian at the University of Virginia, he wrote a book called Ways of Death, in which he looks at the Central African region and how slave markets were promoted and sustained by Europeans in African territories in Central Africa. All of the many violent processes that were involved in this that were short of conquest. The Europeans generally were not sending armies to go conquer people or to go kidnap people directly. But that through the use of trade goods and through the manipulation of local authorities, and through kind of distortion of markets, the Europeans were able to deliberately drive violence among Africans on African soil in ways that ended up killing lots of people who didn't even ever make it to the slave ship. And it is that through those kinds of processes that I think a baseline minimum number for the numbers of Africans killed in the slave trade is probably 30 million people. It could be even more than that. Why is this an important number? It's an important number because in the 18th century, which is the century of the peak of the transatlantic slave trade, the total population, of the entire African continent is estimated to have been about 100 million people. So all of the people killed among these 30 million people didn't die this 18th century, but because this was the peak period of the slave trade, most of them did. And so if you think that, let's imagine 15, 20 million Africans were lost to the continent at a period when the African continent's total population was 100 million people, that's an enormous demographic impact on the continent. And I think this was of incredible importance to the stability of Africa and to the prosperity of Africa and to the future prospects of Africa. Why to the stability of Africa? Because the sorts of processes that Miller writes about and that I talked about involve the destruction of social trust, where one group preys upon another group, or where individuals are sort of seduced into this process of essentially kidnapping or tricking other people into trapping them into slavery, right? And this breakdown of social trust, I argue, in fact, in my book, in a substantial portion of the book, has its legacies today, where African political cultures are still affected by this lack of political trust, that this political trust has its roots, the social trust has its roots in the processes that I've just described. The other big consequence looking backward is that Africa at the time of the peak of the expansion of these processes of enslavement and commerce in human beings across the Atlantic for the purpose of feeding this prison and industrial labor complex, had very important polities, political kingdoms and other states of its own, and that these states were essentially derailed by these processes, often very violently. and that we can't really know what would have happened otherwise. There's no sort of analogy to what would have happened if there were not these excess deaths, right? But one can imagine that if Ashanti in Ghana, or Congo in the Congo, or Benin in Nigeria, or Songhai in Mali, or I could name many other very sophisticated polities that existed in the African landscape in this period, had not been disrupted violently through these processes, that we would be looking at a very different Africa today. That the African landscape would have been gradually transformed through its own innate processes, sometimes probably even violently, because Africans, just like people everywhere, are prone to political violence, but that this would have resulted in a much more stable and a much more politically viable environment for the emergence of modern African states than what we have seen. So now looking forward, I'm sorry to go on for so long, but looking forward with your question, you know, I answered the question about political genocide. I'm sorry, cultural genocide from a previous listener. The biggest handicap of Africans is a handicap, in my opinion, I want to say humbly, I'm not African, but in my reading of this history, the biggest handicap of Africans going forward is something that Kwame Nkrumah identified 70 years ago, and that is the balkanization of Africa. It is simply not going to be possible, in my view, for Africa to emerge from its current debilities with such a proliferation of small and weak states. And therefore, Africans have to find a way to come together to undo some of the legacy of colonization, which resulted in the creation of 54 states, many of them landlocked, many of them small, many of them without any kind of coherent organic basis in existence, right? And that through some formula that Africans only can come up with themselves, they're going to have to transcend this. And this can take many forms. It could take the merger of countries. It could mean the federation of companies. It could mean much, much, much stronger regional integration of countries, even preserving the national sovereignty of individual countries. There's not one formula for this. But Africans have an immense amount of work to do on this front, I think, if they are going to forge a path forward that's going to serve the peoples of Africa much better.
Thank you very much. We're out of time, but I would like you to answer this question, and that will be the last one because it has been in the Q&A. And I'm just going to summarize it. It's about what you think about the conversations around reparation and maybe the different stances that different African countries are taking.
I think reparation is a valid question. I think it's an important topic. I think that African Americans should be thinking about reparations. I think that Africans should be thinking about reparations. I think that people in the West Indies and everywhere that this prison industrial labor complex existed for so long should be thinking about reparations. But I don't think that we can come to any healthy sense of what reparation should entail until we first come to terms with the history that I've talked about. In other words, reparations without a much more vigorous engagement with the actual history of the last 500 or 600 years is going to be an empty exercise, that most of us, through no fault of our own, have been miseducated about this history and have been acculturated in very limited ways about what really happened in the last 500 or 600 years, starting from the very beginning, as I told you, with this story that Christopher Columbus sailed across the ocean blue looking for a route to Asia, and then all of the rest of things just began to happen in their own sort of lovely way, right? We need to wrestle with what really happened first, and to have my book is just the beginning of this, and have a much deeper, much more thoroughgoing, much more persistent exploration of these topics and integration into our curricula and into our media. And it is only at that point, I think, that we can have a more purposeful and meaningful discussion of reparations.
Thank you very, very much for a very engaging conversation. And thank you everybody for coming today and asking interesting questions. We'll see you next time. Bye.